Just because of a leash bearing a military training tag, 3 white police officers cornered an elderly black woman in the middle of a public park, sneering at her purple coat and the kind of dog owned by those who love to play victim. One of them tapped the leash as if appraising merchandise. Another kept a nylon zip tie ready, their eyes filled with condescension as though the verdict had already been decided. But what they didn't know, she was a former commander of a top-secret K-9 combat training unit, once deployed in Afghanistan. Who do you think needs retraining? The morning unfolded in a lavender haze. The sky, a faded lilac, stretched thin across the quiet edges of Fairview Park. Dew clung to the blades of grass, refracting the soft light, but everything else felt unnaturally still, like the air was holding its breath. Mavis Hampton walked in silence, her gait slow but sure, each step deliberate, measured. A deep purple coat draped over her shoulders, neat but worn, the collar turned slightly up against the breeze. Her hand, aged but steady, held the leash of a Belgian Malinois, ghost whose every step matched hers like clockwork, calm, obedient, exact. At her side, a little girl skipped a beat or two behind, humming something under her breath. She wore yellow boots that squelched with each step on the damp path. Her tiny hand clutched the hem of Mavis's coat whenever a leaf crunched too loudly or a bird took off too suddenly. Ghost, meanwhile, moved with eyes forward, posture coiled but never tense. His leash was secured with a military-grade clip, the kind rarely seen outside of combat or law enforcement. A small dark ID tag gleamed faintly under the early sun, hanging motionless despite the morning breeze. Someone was watching. A squad car idled along the park's main drive, blinked with a slow rotation of red and blue, engine running low. Inside, 3 uniformed officers watched the trio. One of them, a man with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses, leaned forward slightly as Mavis and Ghost passed. His gaze landed on the leash, then followed the tag. He squinted, then smirked. "You see that?" he muttered to his partner, elbowing him. "Military ID tag. On a Belgian. That purple coat. What the hell is that? Protest fashion or privilege cosplay?" The second cop leaned forward. "Damn near looks like a setup. Who the hell walks a Malinois like that in this neighborhood?" The third remained silent, but his hand rested on the dash cam remote, finger tapping once, twice. Mavis didn't break stride. Her face betrayed nothing. She heard them, she always did, but her eyes remained on the path. Ghost didn't look either, until the moment the squad car door opened with a clack. Ghost stopped, eyes swinging sideways. He didn't growl, didn't flinch, but his gaze, sharp as a scalpel, locked onto the tiny camera mounted on the cruiser's front bumper, just for a second. Then he resumed walking as though nothing had happened. The leash didn't pull. "No military dog training in residential areas," it read in peeling red letters. The wind knocked it sideways and it clanged hard against the steel post. A dull, scraping note like a warning bell that no one acknowledged. A young mother noticed them approaching. She stepped off the path, pulling her son by the arm so fast he nearly tripped. Her voice was loud, unfiltered. "Careful, that's one of those attack dogs. You don't want to end up on the news." The little boy looked back, confused. "But it's just walking." She didn't reply. Ghost didn't blink. Mavis's fingers adjusted slightly on the leash, just a subtle rotation of the wrist. Not correct, not controlled. Just presence. The leash never jerked, the dog never pulled. He just stayed beside her. Always exactly beside her. The 3 officers exited the cruiser with the kind of posture that announced doubt disguised as authority. The lead officer, tall, lean, with an overconfident swagger, approached first. His boots crushed the gravel louder than necessary. He looked down at the dog, then up at Mavis, then let his eyes drop to the leash. He squinted. "That's a military clip," he said, too loud for casual. Mavis didn't respond. Her expression was calm, unreadable. The second officer, shorter, broader, stepped forward and tapped the leash with 2 fingers. "You walking this dog for someone, ma'am?" he asked, sarcasm sitting in the vowels. Still nothing, just that silence. Measured, heavy. The third cop, the quiet one, leaned slightly sideways, craning his neck toward the child. The girl stepped closer to Mavis, burying her face into the coat. She didn't say anything until she looked up, eyes wet and confused. "Grandma," she said quietly, "why are they looking at me like that?" Ghost turned his head slowly. First toward the girl, then toward the man who had looked at her. It was subtle, no growl, no teeth, just a shift in body language that made the air colder by a few degrees. The lead officer grinned, spreading his arms. Purple coat, military leash, Belgian Malinois. That's a hell of a combo. Looks like someone's trying hard to look important. He took a step forward and bent slightly to get a better look at the tag. Who prints fake military IDs for dogs now? Etsy? His tone was sharp, pointed. He didn't laugh, but he smirked at his joke. Mavis didn't blink. Her grip on the leash was unchanged, held lightly between thumb and forefinger. The little girl's hand gripped tighter at the hem of her coat. Ghost's ears didn't twitch. His shoulders didn't shift, but something about his stare, forward again into the middle distance, felt intentional, not watchful, not curious, just aware. One of the cops, one who tapped the leash, raised a brow and clicked his tongue. "Look at this," he said, reaching out again and flicking the tag. "Cheap-ass dog show cosplay. You think this is some kind of joke?" The click echoed louder than it should have. Ghost's eyes didn't move, but his chest rose once, then held still. A sudden rustle broke the tension for just a second. A woman's laugh down the trail, the sound of sneakers slapping pavement, someone jogging past without looking. In that moment, the cop leaned closer, letting his hand rest for a beat too long on the leash itself. Mavis's voice finally broke the silence. Low, even. "You should stop." He blinked. "What was that?" "I said," she repeated, gaze finally lifting, "you should stop touching what you don't understand." There was no rise in her tone, no threat. But something in the quiet gravity of her voice made the third cop, the silent one, shift uncomfortably and take a step back. Ghost didn't growl, didn't move, but somehow the line between calm and consequence had been crossed, even if no one could quite say when. From across the street, a clatter sounded as the wind slammed the sign again. Metal striking metal, once, then again, then stillness. A bird flew overhead. The squad car's camera blinked red once. Mavis walked forward. Ghost followed. No one said another word. The moment unspooled like tension held between fingertips. One heartbeat after Mavis turned away. Ghost's stride still in perfect rhythm beside her. The click of a boot behind them broke the quiet again. The officers didn't let it go. They moved closer this time. Less curious now, more confrontational. One of them, lips twisted in a smirk that was more warning than warmth, stepped within reach, fingers grazing the ID tag hanging from Ghost's leash. "Tag," he scoffed. "Is this some color print stunt? What is this, retired cosplay?" The tag swung gently, catching morning light. Ghost's body responded with a precise shift. He stepped back, just one calculated movement. Exactly measured. He didn't growl, he didn't snap, he simply moved. Between the man and Mavis, the leash never stretched, the signal never broke. The little girl stiffened, her eyes flicking from the man's face to her grandmother's hand. "Grandma," she whispered, "why do they look at me like that?" Her voice trembled, not because she was afraid of the dog, but of the people who were supposed to protect her. Her fingers dug tighter into the coat sleeve, knuckles white against violet wool. Mavis didn't look down at her. She didn't have to. She felt it. She always had. Behind them, the officer who had been silent now popped the trunk of the cruiser with a mechanical hiss, casually reaching in, not like a man preparing for war, but like someone choosing the right glove to slap. He pulled out a taser and let it hang by his side. No comment, no warning, just presence. The other one, the heavy-set man with the drawl soaked in false courtesy, shifted his weight and reached slowly into his jacket pocket. The corner of a black nylon zip tie poked out like the tongue of a snake, too casual to be missed, too obvious to be ignored. Ghost didn't growl, he didn't even twitch, but he moved. Exactly one step, not toward, not away, just back. A single calculated retreat, the kind of movement that wasn't a reaction but protocol. And then he stopped. Square again, placing himself exactly between Mavis and the advancing officers. His ears pointed forward, his body aligned, his head tilted. Not much, just enough to catch a signal that hadn't yet been given. It was the kind of posture that said everything words refused to. The officer with the smirk leaned down, still circling the tag with his fingers. Looks fancy, shiny, but probably made on a discount printer in somebody's basement. That's what this is, isn't it? A retired fantasy. Some old woman playing dress-up with her mud and a memory. His tone was all syrup and spit. Sweet, slow, and venomous. He didn't see Ghost's eyes shift. He didn't see Mavis's shoulder angle. He just saw what he wanted. A target that wouldn't strike. A few feet away, someone was already holding up their phone, live streaming without saying a word. The voice carried away. Cops surrounding a black grandma and a military dog, he whispered. What could go wrong? The phrase wasn't loud, but the silence it left behind was louder. The air began to compress, not with sound, not with movement, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that's about to break but doesn't. The kind that makes your breath catch because something in your gut knows the room has already chosen sides, and no one's sure what side they're on. Ghost's eyes never blinked. His head held that slight angle, like a switch half-turned, waiting. Mavis did not raise her voice. She did not take a step, but when she turned her face toward the officer with a smirk, her stare made his laugh catch in his throat. You think silence is submission? She said, her voice as soft as dusk and as sharp as a bayonet, but it's the only language your kind never learned to fear. The taser hummed faintly in its standby charge. The zip tie crinkled in its plastic curve. Ghost didn't move, but the moment leaned and waited. The smirk cracked for a fraction of a second, just enough for the man to blink, like something brushed against his pride. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with edges, with decisions unspoken, with the weight of eyes that had seen too much and yet refused to close. Ghost's muscles didn't flex, his tail didn't twitch, but his entire body became a question no one had asked out loud. The man with the taser shifted again, this time glancing sideways at his colleague, a silent conversation behind narrowed eyes. The officer with the nylon tie let it slide back into his pocket, the motion slow, deliberate, like he was placing something away that still had teeth. You're real quiet, ma'am, he said, stepping closer, voice lower now, almost rehearsed. That's supposed to scare us, or just confuse the dog? He paused. Or maybe it ain't trained after all. Maybe it just walks like it's important, so no one asks what it's for. Mavis tilted her head just slightly. If it were for you, she said, you'd already know. The child's eyes darted between them. She couldn't understand the language of intimidation yet, but she understood the tone. She saw Ghost's stance, saw how her grandmother's coat never moved, how the leash stayed like iron between them. She held her breath. The officer holding the taser rolled it in his palm. Looks like a trigger-happy accessory, not a real canine. What's the plan here, lady? Scare the neighbors, make a scene, go viral? His sarcasm didn't mask the tremble in his fingers. A voice from across the street said, not loudly, but with intent, it's already viral. More phones came out. No one laughed. A passing jogger slowed. Someone behind a baby stroller turned and started filming with both hands. The world had learned to recognize scenes like this, quiet, simmering, almost ordinary, until it wasn't. Ghost moved again, just his head, lining up his gaze with the man holding the taser. Don't do it, someone muttered in the crowd, to no one in particular. The taser-holding officer hesitated. Ghost blinked once, and everything stopped moving. The nylon leash remained untouched in Mavis's fingers, but it might as well have been made of lightning. Ghost stood not like an animal, but like a vector, a pressure point waiting to be released. The officer with the smirk cleared his throat. I've seen dogs trained to look tough. This one's got stage presence, I'll give you that. But I've also seen people use props when they want attention. His eyes narrowed. This isn't the army anymore. This is a park, and you, lady, are one word away from obstruction. Mavis let the wind speak for a moment before answering. Then pick your word, she said. More people were watching now. More phones. A low car alarm blipped somewhere in the distance. Someone coughed. Ghost didn't move, and no one wanted to be the first to break the standoff. The officer with the taser looked to his partner, the smirk fading into something uncertain. His hand didn't lower, but his grip shifted. Behind them, the cruiser door creaked slightly open as the third officer stepped halfway out, unsure whether to intervene or just bear witness. He squinted into the light, as if the truth of what was unfolding couldn't be seen all at once. Ghost remained centered, not aggressive, not submissive, simply poised. This was the kind of posture that made the air brittle. The little girl clung tighter to Mavis's coat, burying her face for a moment before peeking out again. Her eyes were round, wide, and unblinking. She whispered, "Why are they acting like he did something?" No one answered her. No one could, because everyone was waiting for someone else to say it first. The crowd across the street grew by 3, then 5. Someone muttered, "Don't touch them," and it rippled outward like a warning coated in breath. The officer with the zip tie shifted again, then pulled his hand free of his pocket, empty. But the threat had already been drawn. Words unspoken still had weight. "You think this is a show," Mavis said, her voice cool, shaped like flint. "You think silence is stage lighting, that we stand still to give you room. But this isn't your script." The officer with the smirk tried to recover it with volume. "You want a script? Here's one. I see a combat leash, a dog with an ID tag I don't recognize, a civilian making a scene, and a crowd ready to riot the moment someone breathes wrong." His eyes narrowed. "We're not the ones with something to prove." "No," Mavis said. "You're the one still trying to remember what you forgot." She didn't blink. That fear comes before power, not after it. Ghost blinked, his head tilted back to neutral. Still waiting, still listening, still ready. Mavis reached into her pocket, not fast, not slow, and pulled out nothing but a single black glove. She slid it onto her right hand. Then she turned, her back to the officers. "Walk," she said. Ghost followed. The little girl did too, and the leash never pulled. They didn't speak as they walked. The little girl glancing once over her shoulder, then deciding not to look back again. Behind them, the tension still hung in the air, but it no longer belonged to them. It was residue left on those who hesitated, those who mocked, those who touched what was not theirs to command. Ghost moved with that same unnatural quiet, as if even his breathing refused to be heard by men who misunderstood silence. The wind caught the leash for just a second, enough to flick it sideways, then settled. A passing cyclist slowed down, eyes wide, and did not comment. The crowd dispersed slowly, some shaking their heads, some still recording. But no one spoke to the officers, not anymore, not after what they'd seen, and chosen not to stop. The message had landed, not in volume, but in weight. And that weight stayed behind, pressing into every inch of pavement they'd dared to stand on. The silence stretched behind them like a wire drawn taut, but it didn't break. It simply followed. Mavis walked without turning, the child's hand tucked safely against her side. Ghost pacing precisely at her heel, silent as breath, steady as pulse. Yet the officers didn't fall back. Footsteps echoed behind them again, deliberate, heavier now, as though someone had mistaken stillness for surrender. One step closer, then another. A hand reached forward and landed on Mavis's shoulder. Not rough, not violent, but entitled. "Ma'am," came the voice, masculine, clipped and dry. "Whose dog is this?" Ghost stopped mid-step. His body didn't twist, but his head pivoted. The motion was crisp, silent, and surgical. He turned, not toward the sound or the movement, but to the exact direction of the speaker's voice, as if triangulated, pinpointed, pre-calculated. His eyes met the man's. That single moment, without bark, without growl, hit harder than a snarl. The officer faltered a half-breath but didn't withdraw. "I said," he repeated, louder now, "who does this dog belong to?" His tone wrapped itself in assumption, the kind that came not from curiosity but from entitlement. The body cam on his chest was tilted, off angle, pointed just enough downward that it missed both his posture and Mavis's face entirely. A red light blinked, then flickered, then steadied again. Mavis didn't answer. She didn't shift. Her hand remained on the leash, 2 fingers only, relaxed, yet locked. The weight of her stillness was heavier than the officer's entire stance. She wasn't ignoring him, she simply gave him no place in her space. From the crowd, a murmur rose. Not loud, not unanimous, but enough. One voice cut through, cracked and sharp. "She's from Fort Bragg," an older man said, cupping his mouth. "Used to train dogs. Top unit. Everyone knew her back then." Another voice echoed, "She's not walking that dog. That dog's walking with her." The female officer in the group, young, jaw tense, eyes flicking between her colleagues and the woman, took half a step forward, then stopped. Her hand hovered near her belt, not grabbing for anything, just hanging there, uncommitted. The indecision etched itself across her shoulders. Ghost moved again. Barely. His front paw shifted half a step to the left. The motion was surgical, as if aligning his vector. The angle now placed him squarely facing the officer with the taser from before. The taser, still in its holster, blinked faintly with a power light. The red LED blinked once. Ghost's head stayed tilted. Nothing about his body moved, but he had a line. A beat passed, then another. The sound of a camera chirped. Beep, sharp and mechanical. A lens refocused. A journalist, standing near the crowd's edge, had just pressed rec. The camera's sound was like a pin dropped in a vault. Heads turned, not toward the woman, not toward the dog, but toward the inevitability that now had an audience. The officer, whose hand still hovered near Mavis's shoulder, withdrew slowly, not like a man retreating, but like someone pretending he had never touched what now burned beneath his skin. His fingers curled back into his palm, and he stepped back just enough to signal retreat without admitting it. The female officer looked at him, just a glance, but enough to note it, and still no one moved further. Ghost remained statuesque, but his presence was kinetic. Every inch of his body hummed with unspent precision. He was neither restrained nor dormant. He was gathering. Every breath he took looked rehearsed, timed between stimulus and response. The crowd, once murmuring, now held its collective breath, sensing the tension without understanding the language. Their silence wasn't passive, it was charged, the kind of quiet that could record everything without a single sound wave. The officer who'd asked the question tried again, this time shifting tactics. "Look, ma'am," he said, voice dropping, layering faux concern beneath his badge. "We just want to make sure everything's in order. That's all. You know how people are these days. Someone sees a dog like this and they panic. We're just here to de-escalate." His mouth smiled. His eyes did not. Mavis turned, but not fully. Just enough for her profile to sharpen against the light. "Then why did you come armed for escalation?" Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The clarity of it sliced through his posture like a scalpel. He blinked. She continued, "You didn't see panic, you saw control, and you didn't know what to do with it." The crowd shifted again. The journalist lowered his lens, adjusting the angle, capturing the framing of a dog not leashed but aligned. Ghost's stare had not broken. It had simply followed, without blinking, without release. Another officer, older, distant, still near the car, adjusted the body cam on his chest. The angle had been crooked the whole time. It now faced directly forward, as though memory could be edited with a tilt. His fingers fumbled with the button. Too late. The red light had been on since before he moved. Someone whispered from the back, "They're losing the thread." It wasn't clear if they meant the officers or the story, or both. The woman officer stepped closer now, not threatening, not defensive, just present. She looked at Ghost, then at Mavis, then back at her colleagues. "She's not doing anything wrong," she said quietly, "but enough. We're escalating this." The silence that followed wasn't approval, it was realization. A breath too long, a wait too sharp. Mavis turned fully now. Ghost remained unmoved. Her face was quiet, her eyes unreadable, but when she spoke, it felt like something ancient had surfaced. "You brought questions," she said, "but you already decided your answer." The statement didn't shout, it didn't demand, but it landed like a verdict. The officer who had tried to play the role of peacemaker stood still, lips parted as if to reply, but nothing followed. He had walked into this encounter believing the badge was enough, that posture substituted for presence. What stood before him now was not resistance. It was a refusal. Ghost took one breath, low, even, and deliberate. His paws were steady, planted, not braced, but grounded, like a monument that had chosen where to stand. The journalist in the back zoomed in, lens narrowing on the leash, the two fingers holding it, the absence of strain between woman and dog. A boy at the edge of the crowd whispered to his father, "It's not even pulling," and his father said nothing. What could he say? This wasn't about pulling. This was about not needing to. A distant siren rose, unrelated, far off. It came and went like a breath through broken glass. The female officer turned her head slightly, as if calculating the weight of her next word. Then she looked at her team. "She's not resisting," she said, "and the dog hasn't made a single threatening move. We're the ones circling her." The smirking officer scoffed under his breath, masking the fracture in his confidence. "Yeah, well, this isn't normal. This whole thing, this vibe, it's staged. It's a performance. And then why are you losing control of it?" the younger woman asked. That question didn't just hang in the air. It cut through it. Mavis said nothing. She simply turned slightly toward Ghost. The dog didn't move, but his ears adjusted by a millimeter, just enough to catch something others couldn't hear. A command not given, a cue not spoken, a world not yet triggered. The man with the taser glanced down at it, suddenly aware that it looked more like fear than policy. He slid it into its holster, not because he was told to, but because it no longer belonged in his hand. The tension didn't vanish, it transferred into him. A nearby vendor pushed a cart slowly past the crowd, pausing just long enough to glance at the scene. "She used to teach at Fort Bragg," he said, unprompted. "Dogs like that don't act unless you tell 'em, and she don't look like she's said a damn word." That, more than anything, sealed it, because the threat wasn't in action, it was in the decision not to act. The officer with the zip tie fumbled for his radio, muttering something into the static, but the wind carried away his words. No backup arrived. No response came. The red light on the journalist's camera blinked steadily. The leash remained slack. The child, finally exhaling, let go of her grandmother's sleeve and held her wrist. She looked down at Ghost, not scared, not confused, just watching, and Ghost, sensing nothing had changed, glanced at her, brief, sharp, and then back to forward. Mavis looked at the officers once more, her face now like stone, weathered by storms that never made the news. "You didn't want to know whose dog this is," she said. "You wanted to know if I was going to apologize for how he stands." And with that, she turned. The leash moved. Ghost moved. The crowd did not. They watched her walk through the moment without asking for permission, the child in step, the dog poised like shadow armor. Nothing shattered, nothing screamed, but everything shifted. The woman officer remained rooted. The smirk faded. The cameras stayed on, and the silence left behind was louder than anything they could have shouted. The crowd began to shift, not in chaos, but in realization. Something had occurred, not an event, but a recalibration. The center of weight had moved, and it had not gone toward the badges. It had gone with the woman, the child, and the dog. A man standing near the bench lowered his phone, looked down at the screen, then looked up again, his expression no longer uncertain. The footage had already been clipped, shared, frozen. It didn't need edits, it didn't need context. The posture said enough. A teenage girl in a hoodie whispered to her friend. She didn't even flinch. Her friend replied, "That dog didn't either. They weren't scared. They were learning. They were memorizing." And Ghost, silent, exact, unreadable, remained exactly 1/2 pace ahead of the moment. He was not a warning. He was the absence of mistakes. The officers said nothing else. The wind blew again, rattling the empty leash hook on the cruiser. The sound was metallic, like an idea losing its shape. In the distance, the sound of another siren rose, real this time, closer, but nobody moved. The camera stayed steady. The moment had already decided who it belonged to. As Mavis turned the corner out of view, the tension didn't leave with her. It stayed, and it waited, because everyone now understood this was not the end of anything. It was the signal that something had already started. No command had been spoken, no violence had erupted, but something far louder than conflict had taken place. Ghost did not look back. Mavis did not break stride. The officers remained where they stood, caught between a question they never meant to ask and an answer that refused to be denied. Ghost kept walking. Nothing changed. Everything shifted. Ghost kept walking. Nothing changed. Everything shifted. But shifts leave aftershocks, and some come from the smallest things. As the crowd thinned and the officers held their places like statues left in the wrong exhibit, Mavis and her granddaughter crossed the bend of the path where the noise of footsteps faded and the silence of breath remained. That was when the girl's voice cracked. Not a question this time, not confusion, a cry. She pulled at her grandmother's sleeve, sobbing hard. The kind of cry that has nothing to do with dogs or police or parks, but everything to do with being small in a world that doesn't blink before pointing. The sound cut through the space with a rawness that no one could ignore. Her shoulders trembled. Her face was tucked into the fabric. She didn't understand why her body felt like it was under attack, only that it was. Ghost froze. His back leg locked. His shoulder twisted just enough to pivot weight toward the child. Then he moved. Not a lunge, not a leap, a half step forward. A shift of balance and readiness, not for attack, for protection. The movement was silent. No growl, no bark, just the air around him realigning itself. But Mavis raised her hand. Not high, not fast, just enough to draw a line in the space between them. Her fingers snapped gently downward and Ghost stopped. Instantly. No hesitation. He took a small half-step back, positioning himself once again at her side, not in front. The girl's cries didn't stop. They deepened. She wasn't crying for danger. She was crying for being yelled at, for the eyes that hadn't stopped staring, for a fear that didn't belong to her, but had been handed down like a curse. One of the officers, trying to claw back control, or maybe relevance, stepped forward again, this time holding up his phone, the lens active, the screen facing her like a weapon. "Smile for the camera," he sneered. "Or is this all part of the performance?" Choreographed silence, rehearsed tears, and a military mutt for stage props. He crouched slightly, tilting the phone low, right toward Ghost. "What is it then? Military dog or show dog? What tricks does it do? Play dead or play soldier?" Ghost's ears flattened by a fraction. His spine remained level. Then came the sound. Not loud, not immediate. A low, rising growl. Deep, guttural, stretched thin like pressure behind glass. The kind of sound that didn't come from the throat, but from somewhere older. Not barking, not breaking formation, just resonance. Threat wrapped in silence. The officer leaned in further, grinning now, emboldened by the growl. "There it is. That's what you've got under control? Sounds more like a liability than a legacy." He tilted the phone even closer, letting the lens nearly touch Ghost's snout. The screen's glare reflected in the dog's eyes. Two cold, unblinking circles locking onto their mirrored twin. A sharp sound broke the standoff, not from anyone present, but from the world beside them. A sudden slap of glass against metal, violent and crisp, echoed across the street. The windshield of a nearby parked car was struck by something unseen, maybe wind, maybe a falling branch, but the noise cracked through the moment like a gunshot's ghost. Ghost blinked once, just once, a single motion, not startled, registered. Mavis shifted her weight slightly, hand still low, still composed, and glanced at her wristwatch. She pressed one of the small side buttons. No one noticed, not really. Her movement was too smooth, too subtle to register. Yet the atmosphere tilted. It was as though the ground beneath them changed elevation without moving. Down the street, a vehicle appeared. A dark green frame, matte paint, no tags on the side. An old military Humvee. It moved slowly, its engine deep and dull, rolling forward like it wasn't part of the modern world. The driver, a man in desert fatigues with mirrored sunglasses, caught sight of Ghost and stopped. The man's head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowed. Then, without touching his horn or calling attention, he shifted gears and backed away, slow, deliberate, without a word. Ghost didn't move, but his tail straightened. The child was quieter now, her breath slowing in hiccups. Her eyes were red, her cheeks damp. Mavis still hadn't spoken. She didn't console. She didn't correct. She simply stood, a figure whose silence dared others to earn it. The officer with the phone took a step back, finally recognizing the growl hadn't stopped. It hadn't risen either. It just lingered, like smoke curling under a door. Waiting. Another officer stepped forward. Not the one with the phone, not the silent woman, but a new face, one who had stayed back until now. His steps were light, but his mouth was crooked with disdain. "You people are real good at dramatics," he said, dragging each word. "Theatrics in the park, a kid with tears, and a dog trained to stare. This is what retirement looks like now?" No one replied. He gestured toward Ghost, then toward the girl. "Tell me, when you trained that beast, did you also teach it to comfort scared little girls, or just to play statue for the crowd?" The growl dipped lower. Ghost's body hadn't moved, but his jawline tightened. His chest expanded just enough for the sound to deepen. It rolled through the ground like vibration, not volume. The phone man laughed, short and clipped. "I'm starting to think this thing isn't trained, it's programmed. What's next? It salutes when you sneeze?" Behind them, a man in a hoodie muttered, "This dog's doing more to stay calm than any of them are to stay human." Mavis didn't blink. She didn't move. Her entire form was a silence that had stopped being passive. It had become deliberate, tactical. Then something small shifted. Ghost's front paw flexed just once. Toes splayed for a fraction of a second against the pavement. It wasn't a warning, it was calibration. The child's breath had returned. She wiped her face on her sleeve, looked up at Ghost, and whispered, "He's not mad, he's just listening." And that sentence, said too softly for the officers to hear, but just loud enough for the journalist's mic, struck like a bell in a cathedral. The growl faded, not cut, not stopped, faded, like a command had been followed without being given. The man with the taser from earlier looked at the leash again, still slack, still held by 2 fingers. Still total control. The journalist stopped filming and took a breath. That wasn't a growl, he said to himself. That was a countdown. No one dared speak next. The tension had become an ecosystem of its own. Self-sustaining, oxygen-thin, suspended in a balance where even breath might trigger collapse. The officers didn't retreat, but they no longer advanced. Not physically, not rhetorically. They had run out of questions that didn't expose themselves. The one with the crooked smile tried once more, but the momentum was gone. "Lady, you're pushing it," he muttered. The bravado now a residue more than a threat. He didn't finish. Not because he chose restraint, but because the words no longer had gravity. Ghost adjusted again. Not forward, not back. Just weight redistribution. A soldier resetting stance, bracing not for attack, but for continuation. A move so small it would be invisible if not for the quiet. The child tugged at Mavis's coat. "Can we go now?" she whispered, tired but calm. Mavis didn't answer with words. She glanced once to her left. The path cleared ahead and nodded once. She turned. Ghost followed. The girl's hand returned to the coat hem, but this time out of habit, not fear. The trio moved like a tide slipping back into the ocean, and in their wake, a silence, more disciplined than any command. Behind them, the officers stood as if awaiting a cue that never came. The cameras remained. The audience shifted, some turning away, others pressing stop, not because it was over, but because the ending had not erupted. It had dissolved. The Humvee that had turned away earlier was long gone. The street regained its hum. Birds returned to the tree branches. The park resumed its rhythm, almost resentfully. One officer finally spoke, voice dry. She never raised her voice. Another added, "Neither did the dog." A third, "But I swear to God, I'd never felt that close to breaking." A father leaned down to his child nearby. "You saw that?" he asked. The kid nodded. "What did you learn?" The child replied, "The loudest thing wasn't the dog." The father nodded once. "Good." And with that, the world began to breathe again. But not the same. A few paces away from where it all began, Mavis slowed just enough to let the moment settle into place behind her. The child at her side no longer sniffled. She looked forward now, as if a layer of film had been peeled off the world, revealing its fragile lines and unspoken currents. Ghost walked with the same measured grace, but his breathing had changed. Slower now, deeper, not out of exertion, but readiness returning to rest. His muscles relaxed, not because the danger had passed, but because the decision had. A woman from the crowd finally spoke. "She didn't do anything," her voice cracked, but her words carried. And still, they backed off. It wasn't a compliment, it was a confession. Someone else added, "She didn't need to yell." Another, more distant, "That wasn't silence, that was a decision." The officers remained rooted, not because they were disciplined, but because they were exposed. Nothing in their training had prepared them for being outmatched by someone who never moved. The footage would circulate, dissected, captioned, reframed, but the ones present would remember it not as a video, but as a feeling, an entire standoff held in place by a leash that never pulled and a voice that never cracked. Mavis reached the edge of the park where the sidewalk met the street, paused and turned, not fully, just enough to cast a final glance back, not at the officers, not in the crowd, at nothing, really, a brief, weightless moment. Then she turned away for good. Ghost paused beside her. His eyes followed her gaze, saw nothing, and blinked once. His tail moved, a single sway, then stilled. The leash remained loose, 2 fingers still enough to write laws with. Behind them, the street returned to noise. Engines, footsteps, birds, but none of it was the same. The silence had left a mark, and somewhere unnoticed, a wind shifted a street sign just enough to clink against the post again, once, twice, and then stillness. Not everything ends with sound. Some things end because silence has already spoken. Not everything ends with sound. Some things end because silence has already spoken. But what followed the silence that day was not rest. It was the recoil, the kind that comes after a trigger is held down too long, after control is mistaken for absence, and authority forgets its reflection. Mavis continued walking, her steps measured, as if pacing not just the path beneath her, but the weight of every eye that refused to blink. Ghost was beside her, his body fluid, his pace exact, the leash still held by 2 fingers that had once pulled men from burning wreckage and taught animals not how to attack, but when not to. They passed a second cruiser parked not far from the tree line. The man leaning against it was different. Not new, not old, but something in between. His badge was crooked, his sunglasses mirrored. His laugh came before the joke. "So he speaks human, huh?" he called out, arms folded like a man daring the wind to hit him. "That's what this is? Magic word and he freezes? Let's try it, shall we?" Before anyone could react, he took 2 steps forward and slapped the side of Ghost's head. Not hard, but not soft either, like someone tapping a vending machine to see if it breaks. Nothing happened. No snarl, no leap, no recoil. Ghost simply remained still. But the air around him snapped cold. His eyes didn't widen. They contracted. Sharp, clean, surgical, like the reticle of a sniper scope tightening. The man laughed harder. "Thought so. You know, I used to train K9S down in Georgia. Dogs like this, 3 days tops, and they're biting kneecaps on command. You get one to sit, one to bark, one to snap. Easy. You don't need witchcraft. You just need to stop treating him like royalty." Someone in the crowd shouted, "Hey, stop it!" A teenager, voice shaking, righteous but small. The officer turned toward the sound, squinting through his smirk. "You want to join the training, kid?" Mavis said nothing. She didn't flinch. Her hand didn't move. But Ghost's body was different now. His hind legs lowered, not crouching, just preparing. He sat, not slouched, but poised, the kind of sitting a panther does before jumping. His body was a diagram of intention. Then, as if the leash itself needed to declare allegiance, a red dot blinked near Ghost's paw, danced forward and hit the grass. A laser. Precision red, fired not by threat, but by sensor. The leash was not just a leash, it was a circuit, and the dog was not just waiting, he was calculating. The dot hovered for a breath, then faded. No sound signaled its departure, but everyone saw it. The officer, still mid-smirk, missed it entirely. He only noticed the shift in atmosphere, how it thickened. He looked back down at Ghost and frowned. "What, you waiting for applause now?" Ghost didn't move. His ears stayed level, his posture unwavering, but under the skin, muscles locked, his breathing slowed to a near-invisible cadence, chest rising in micro-increments. He was not reacting, he was measuring. Mavis's voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. It was the kind of word that could be missed entirely if your attention strayed even a second. "Cam," she said. It dropped like a seismic marker. Ghost froze, not just paused, but arrested, his limbs locked, not in fear, but in reception. The entire sequence of tension coiled inside him, all potential action compressed into stillness. The officer laughed again, but this time it cracked. "Oh, I see. Magic word. That it? Little Vietnamese trick word?" He reached again. Slower this time, maybe to test a line. His hand hovered near Ghost's ear. "I wonder what happens if I say it." He never got the chance. The laser dot reappeared. This time it moved faster, across Ghost's chest, to the dirt, back to the leash. It wasn't meant to guide, it was meant to signal. A closed loop, a lock. The officer stepped back. Only now did he seem to feel what others had already sensed. "Okay," he muttered. "Okay, so it's rigged, so what? It's just hardware, that's not control, that's overkill." But it wasn't overkill, it was discipline made visible. A woman behind the barrier whispered, "That's not a dog, that's a doctrine." The teenager who had yelled before stood taller now, holding up a phone. "You're on camera," he said. "You know that, right?" The officer glared. "Get that thing out of my face." "Or what?" The teen shot back. "You gonna slap me too?" Mavis turned slightly, just enough to look back, not at the officer, not at the camera, but at the distance between them all. She said nothing more. Ghost's breathing returned to normal. The tension leaked out of his limbs without a twitch. He was back at rest, but never unarmed. The tension that followed wasn't explosive. It didn't need to be. It was a field, a gravitational one, pulling all noise into its core and silencing it before it could rise. Ghost's stillness was a verdict, not a delay. The officer, now too aware of the cameras, too aware of how alone he looked, tried to square his stance. "I didn't touch the girl," he muttered, as if to a future trial. "I didn't even threaten her." This is all posturing. No one believed him, not even himself. Mavis turned back toward Ghost. Her gaze never landed on the officer again. He was no longer a variable. She reached down and brushed the air near Ghost's neck, not touching, just realigning the leash. It gleamed faintly under the sun, worn black nylon, but was lined with something unseen. The red light disappeared once more. Ghost looked up, awaiting further input. He did not pant. He did not twitch. He simply waited and waited. The crowd, emboldened now, formed a perimeter of attention. No chants, no shouting, just the weight of observation. Every eye was a camera. Every camera, a consequence. Across the street, a black SUV pulled up and paused. Its windows didn't lower. It didn't park, but the presence was enough. Someone inside was watching. A signal, not a threat, not reinforcement, witness. Ghost shifted his weight again. Only now did it become clear. He had never settled. He had simply slowed. The precision of it all, the response to a word, the restraint after contact, the coordination with unseen tech. It wasn't loyalty, it was policy. One of the senior officers finally moved forward. Not the mouthy one, not the crooked badge, but a lieutenant with no sunglasses and no swagger. He looked at Mavis, then at Ghost. Then he looked at the leash, His mouth opened as if to speak, but Mavis cut the moment with just a glance. It wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. It was absolute. He stopped. She gave a small nod, not to him but to Ghost, and the dog, as if released from a state of suspended warfare, stood. No bark, no growl, just a shift from potential energy to motion. And that, more than anything, was the warning. The threat was never the dog. It was what he chose not to do. The lieutenant didn't speak again. His mouth pressed into a line, his hands behind his back like a soldier acknowledging a superior without saluting. The red light on a second body cam blinked, and he didn't turn it off. He didn't need to. Every movement in this clearing had already spoken its truth. Ghost stood like an answer no one wanted, but everyone understood. Still beside Mavis. Still within reach. Still leashed by a thread thinner than any rope. Trust. The officer who had slapped him didn't laugh anymore. His hand twitched by his side, like it was remembering the impact. Not pain, memory. Not guilt, calculation. He took a step back, not because of fear, but because he had nothing left to push forward with. The teenager holding the phone stepped closer to the yellow line that had been drawn earlier by some long-forgotten incident. He didn't raise his voice. "Why'd you hit him?" he asked. No one answered. The man who had done it turned his head. "I said," the teenager repeated, "why'd you hit him?" Still silence. The woman officer, the one who had hesitated hours or maybe lifetimes earlier, stepped to the side. "He didn't resist," she said. "And neither did the dog. That should matter." Her voice wasn't loud, but it landed. Mavis didn't turn. She had already spoken all the words she needed to. She took a step forward, and Ghost followed. The girl at her side was calm now. Not because the threat was gone, but because it had been named, controlled, leashed. Not Ghost, but the moment. A chime echoed from someone's phone. A headline had hit. A clip had spread. A truth had broken orbit. Back at the car, the SUV still waited. Mavis glanced at it once, then kept walking. Ghost stayed beside her, and for the first time since dawn, his tail shifted slightly. Not wagging, adjusting, checking rear clearance. No sirens. No guns, no blood, just one word and everything it carried. The dog did not attack. He obeyed, and that obedience was a threat to those who believed power only comes from force. A voice emerged from somewhere behind the crowd. An older man, maybe a veteran, maybe just someone who recognized discipline when he saw it. "That's not how you train a dog," he said. "That's how you train a legacy." His words didn't seek agreement. They revealed it. Someone in uniform tried to step forward to speak, but the silence caught him. His words never made it past his throat. This wasn't a moment to clarify. It was a moment to recognize. The red dot never returned. It didn't need to. What had needed to be proven had been. The leash was no longer a question. The handler was no longer a mystery. And the dog, well, the dog had made his point without baring a single tooth. Ghost walked as if nothing had happened, and in a way, nothing had. No arrests, no injuries, no chaos. But beneath the calm was a crater. Everyone who had witnessed it knew. They would describe it later and fail to capture its weight. Mavis didn't slow. She didn't glance back again. She didn't need to. The girl looked up and whispered, "Did he know what they were saying?" Mavis replied, "He didn't need to understand their words. He understood their intent." And with that, they crossed the last path of the park. Ghost stepped slightly ahead, not to lead, but to clear the way, not to guard, but to guarantee peace. The storm hadn't come. It had waited and been dismissed with a single word. Not leashed, commanded, because real power doesn't bark. It waits until someone dares to test the silence. The storm hadn't come. It had waited and been dismissed with a single word. Not leashed, commanded, because real power doesn't bark. It waits until someone dares to test the silence. But silence is never permanent. It resets. It watches. Then it moves. The moment shattered not with a roar, not with a siren, but with the soft rasp of old fabric and something far more dangerous. Muscle memory. Mavis lifted her left hand, slowly, methodically, and peeled off the glove with a single pull. The leather folded inward like a shell, giving way to something it was never meant to hold. Beneath it, Her hand was worn but steady, and across the width of her palm ran a scar, deep, wide, purposeful. It didn't speak of an accident. It spoke of choice, the kind earned under pressure, carved by years of decisions no one else was willing to make. Her voice didn't change in pitch but in weight. "Enough," she said, "not to the officers, not to the cameras, to the world." Ghost responded before the syllables had fully settled. His body lowered, not slinking, not crouching, but aligning. His shoulders dropped. His back arched, and the tension in his haunches coiled like a spring held by an unseen force. His eyes sharpened, but his mouth stayed closed. No bark, no growl, just a calculation. An officer, young and dumb enough to think the command wasn't meant for him, took a step forward, hand brushing the edge of his baton. "Ma'am, you need to—" He didn't finish. Mavis's left arm moved, not fast, not wide, but surgically. She stepped into the officer's reach and with a twist of her hip and a redirection of her wrist, caught his arm and flipped him sideways with a precision born from repetition. His feet left the ground for a breath, then landed with the sound of authority meeting gravel. The officer hit the dirt with a grunt and a short-lived flicker of indignation that vanished the moment Mavis straightened. She didn't hover. She didn't posture. She simply reset her stance, the way a soldier resets after neutralizing a threat, not as a gesture of domination, but as a return to equilibrium. Ghost didn't move forward. He didn't need to. The battlefield had already shifted. Another officer's hand brushed against his taser, but the motion froze midway. Ghost began to move, not toward the officer, but sideways, in a slow, deliberate arc. Not a charge, a flank. His paws made no sound on the grass, but his positioning drew a widening semicircle that pulled the officer's gaze from the center outward. One turned to track him, then another. The formation dissolved not from force, but from geometry. Someone in the crowd gasped. "He's not attacking, he's maneuvering." A woman, older, breathless, pointed with a trembling hand. "That's field pattern 3, she said. "That's a perimeter containment arc. They use that in Bosnia." Her voice wasn't speculative, it was a memory. One of the younger officers started to backpedal, only to stumble into his partner's side. The group had become scattered, none of them overtly panicking, but no longer organized. Ghost never broke eye contact with his surroundings, yet never fixated on a single threat. He moved like someone who had memorized every variable before the game began. The camera phones multiplied, their tiny red lights blinking like a second constellation being born in real time. Screens across the country were now watching a dog execute a maneuver once classified under combat suppression protocols. Ghost wasn't a symbol anymore. He was a live broadcast of doctrine, animated, autonomous, and mercilessly precise. A sergeant near the edge of the field raised his radio, as if that would help him make sense of what he was seeing. We've got coordinated animal movement. I think the subject is executing containment patterns," he stammered. No response came from the other end, only static, as if the frequency itself couldn't keep up. Mavis didn't speak. She simply walked past the officer she had downed, her left hand now fully visible, the scar catching what little light filtered through the canopy of oak and pine. Her gait wasn't fast, but purposeful, the kind of walk that comes after years of marching. Not on pavement, but on policy. Not for show, but to survive. Ghost continued his arc, then paused. His tail didn't wag. It pointed. His entire body froze, not in hesitation, but as a marker, a warning. He was signaling not to his handler, but to the system. This is the perimeter. This is the edge of tolerance. Do not cross. Someone in the crowd, young, breathless, live streaming, whispered into their mic. He's not just reacting, he's responding, like he knows the next 10 moves. The comment section exploded. That's not instinct, that's intel. Is he remote controlled? No, look at the handler. She's not doing anything now. He's autonomous. The silence was now weaponized. No more barking, no shouting, just precise movement and the sound of the balance tipping. Ghost's path intersected with the foot of the officer who had reached for his taser earlier, but instead of contact, he stopped just short, turned slightly left, and sat, facing away but blocking the retreat line. The woman cried out, "That's defensive staging. They're protecting a fallback zone." An old man beside her, voice trembling with awe, said, "I haven't seen this since Ramadi." The words spread like wildfire, and then every screen blinked brighter. The live streams were now being reshared, split-screened with old military training footage, frame by frame. Ghost's position matched diagrams that had, until now, only existed in black and white PDF manuals. His movements weren't just similar, they were textbook, strategic, flawless. Then came the pivot, the shift. Mavis raised her hand, not high, just chest level. Her fingers didn't point, they opened, palm toward Ghost. And Ghost responded, not with speed, but with posture. His body turned inward. He began circling again, but this time the circle tightened. It wasn't containment, it was compression. He was folding the space in, shrinking the battleground, drawing the line closer as if declaring, if you hadn't crossed before, now's your last chance to step back. One of the officers, perhaps feeling that invisible line graze his conscience, moved, not a step forward, not backward, but to the side. He holstered his weapon, eyes never leaving Ghost. Another followed, and then another. Only one remained. The one who had laughed. The one who had slapped Ghost hours ago. He stood defiant, hands loose, eyes hard. "This is theater," he muttered, loud enough for the crowd mics to catch. All of this. A dog with tricks, and a woman who thinks silence is power. Mavis didn't reply. Ghost did. He didn't lunge. He didn't bark. He simply stepped toward the man. One clean step, enough to trigger a reaction, not an action. The man flinched, cursed under his breath, and finally lowered his hands. The crowd exhaled, not because it was over, but because Ghost had allowed it to be. Cameras flashed again, but this time the focus was different. Less panic, more reverence. The framing changed. Mavis and Ghost weren't anomalies now. They were precedents, the standard, the doctrine. One feed zoomed in on Ghost's shoulder. There, subtly engraved into the tactical collar, was a number, not a name, a unit designation. Another feed caught the scar on Mavis's palm as she lowered her hand once more. People began to ask questions about command, about restraint, about how a single word from one woman had held back what an entire squad couldn't. A political analyst tweeted, "This isn't about dogs or civilians anymore. It's about chain of command and who's truly in control when no one's pulling a trigger." As Mavis and Ghost walked away from the broken ring of bodies and silence, the crowd shifted, not following, but parting like water. People stared not in fear, but in recalibration. What they thought they knew about command, about dogs, about women like Mavis, was no longer valid. And somewhere between the space where Ghost's paws touched earth and the place where no bullet was needed, a new understanding settled like dust after detonation. Ghost's tail didn't move. He wasn't celebrating, he was cooling down. His shoulders rolled slightly, absorbing the last of the tension like a sponge ringed in steel. When they reached the sidewalk's edge, Mavis paused, not to look back, to look up. The trees swayed overhead, whispering a rhythm only she and Ghost seemed to hear. She whispered something, not a command, not for anyone else, and Ghost sat at her side like it was the only place in the world that made sense. Behind them, officers regrouped, not in anger, in silence. They looked at each other as if seeing for the first time how little they'd understood the equation they'd stepped into. A perimeter wasn't just drawn in space. It had been drawn in the hierarchy, and Ghost had guarded both. The live stream reached a new milestone. 1 million concurrent viewers. 10 million cumulative. A trending phrase took root. Tactical peace. It wasn't just a moment, it was a precedent. It redefined power, not as pressure, but as presence. No sirens followed them, no officers were called out to stop them. The street ahead was empty, and yet every step felt like it was being walked through history. Ghost didn't glance back, not once. Because warriors don't verify silence, they enforce it. The scar on Mavis's palm caught the last light of day as she reached to adjust the leash. Not to pull, just to remind the world it was still connected. Not by force, by trust. A child from the crowd broke ranks and whispered to their mother, "That dog, he never barked." The mother, eyes damp but proud, said, "That's because he didn't need to." In the distance, an old training bell chimed from somewhere forgotten, faint, familiar, like memory on the wind. Ghost heard it, but he kept walking, because the mission wasn't to react. It was to know exactly when not to, and that's what makes a weapon worthy of peace. The leash didn't pull, the air didn't shift, but something underneath the ground itself seemed to give way as Ghost, without hesitation, snapped into motion. It wasn't rage, it wasn't instinct, it was execution. Clean, clinical, calibrated. The officer barely had time to blink, barely had time to process that his hand had grazed the sleeve of Mavis's jacket when Ghost's body compressed into a spring and released. 0.7 seconds. That was the time stamp. That was the gap between intention and consequence. From the moment contact was made to the instant Ghost's body collided with the officer's side. Not teeth first, not claws, but shoulder. Force without malice. Precision without injury. A controlled takedown that flipped the man through the air like a weightless mistake. He hit the ground, wind knocked clean from his lungs, eyes wide with the sudden realization that this wasn't an animal reaction. It was a system responding. The crowd didn't cheer. It froze. Phones zoomed in. One feed slowed the playback, frame by frame. It avoided the throat, the voice whispered. It went for the hip. That's not a dog. Another user typed, "That's a ghost in uniform." A child near the swings clapped. "Just like in movies," they shouted, but this wasn't fiction. It was field work, and Ghost wasn't done. Two other officers, driven more by reflex than sense, pulled weapons. Tasers, not firearms, but the draw was sharp, fast, threatening. Ghost's eyes tracked both, and in the space of a breath his paws touched down, redirected and surged again, this time not for body mass but for wrists. He struck the first hand sideways, knocking the taser from his grip without fracturing a bone. Spun off that momentum, hit the second one's forearm at a downward arc, disrupting muscle but sparing nerve. The movement was too fast for the naked eye but too clean to be chaotic. Ghost didn't snarl, he didn't lose form. He pivoted between bodies like a blade cutting through air. The second taser clattered to the pavement, landing harmlessly inches from the foot of a now visibly shaken officer who had drawn it. His breath caught in his throat as Ghost stared him down, not with fury, but with calculus. He wasn't attacking, he was subtracting variables. The third officer, a bystander until now, reacted with the worst possible instinct. Fear. He stumbled backward, arms flailing, trying to get distance from something his training had never prepared him for. He tripped on uneven concrete, flopped backward, and landed flat on his spine with a grunt that said more about panic than pain. Still, Ghost didn't press the advantage. He stopped, dead center. His body aligned with the trajectory of the last movement, but his limbs went still. Tension held. Energy ready, but no follow-through. A commentator online typed, "He disengaged mid-kill path." Another added, "What kind of animal knows when to stop like that?" But Ghost wasn't following instinct. He was listening for the next cue, and it never came. Because Mavis hadn't said a word. She stood unmoved, watching with the same quiet intensity as a general in the field, one who knows that every motion from her soldier is pre-scripted, pre-cleared, pre-disciplined. She didn't need to shout to stop him. He'd never left her instruction to begin with. The officer on the ground wheezed, stunned but intact. The others looked at one another and then back at Mavis. Their hands now nowhere near weapon. What they faced wasn't a threat. It was a lesson in restraint, disguised as combat. A woman in the crowd whispered, "It's like he knew the difference between defense and destruction." Her voice wasn't recorded by the live stream mics, but the sentiment was everywhere. In the silence, in the awe, in the lack of retaliation, Ghost remained still. His chest moved with slow, practiced breath, his paws steady on the ground, his body pointed but calm. His tail didn't rise. He wasn't posturing. He was awaiting recalibration, his own and theirs. The officer who had hit the ground first finally sat up, coughing, looking at his hands like they belonged to someone else. His voice was barely audible. "It didn't bite me. It could have, but it didn't." From the edge of the field, an older man, former military by posture, if not by clothing, nodded slowly. That was a restraint kill. Inverted strike. Zero lethal technique. He took them down like they were allies being extracted from crossfire. And still, Mavis said nothing. The moment stretched, not like tension, but like comprehension. No one moved. Not the crowd, not the officers, not the dog. It was as if the entire park had entered a state of synchronization, each witness breathing at the same controlled cadence. Ghost shifted just a step. He returned to Mavis's side without a word, without fanfare, positioning himself half a pace behind her left leg. His ears were up, but his posture relaxed. His mission was complete, and it hadn't required blood, just precision, just a correction. Live streams exploded. Hashtags trended. Ghost 0, Humane Dominance 0.7. Commentators compared the footage to Special Forces takedowns, noting the deliberate non-lethal targeting zones, the split-sec threat assessment, the follow-through suppression followed by immediate disengagement. One feed showed Ghost's mid-takedown frame by frame, annotated with angles and force vectors. A behavioral analyst wrote, "We've never seen this level of discretion from a non-human. This isn't just training. This is conscience, executed through protocol." And at the center of it all, Mavis didn't react. Her stillness wasn't stoic, it was sovereign. She turned slightly not to show her face to the crowd, but to signal that the theater was closed. The demonstration had concluded. She didn't acknowledge the officers. She didn't look at the fallen. Her hand reached for Ghost's leash, not as a command, but as closure. Contact reestablished, circuit sealed, and Ghost, who could have mauled, who could have maimed, simply looked forward again. A girl in the crowd, maybe 10, whispered, "He protected them, even when they didn't deserve it." And no one contradicted her, because it was true, and it was terrifying, and it was just. Back at the edge of the lawn, reporters lowered their microphones. The silence had weight now. It didn't feel like a void. It felt like evidence. The kind of moment that would be replayed, dissected, and taught. Not in police academies first, but in war colleges, in ethics classes, in courtrooms, trying to define the line between threat and restraint. A well-known anchor cut into the feed. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice steady, "what we're witnessing is not just a use-of-force incident. It is an inflection point in modern civilian response and tactical ethics. This dog, designated Ghost, has redefined the language of defense." The officer who had fallen furthest from Ghost rose unsteadily and took off his cap. Not in shame, in acknowledgement. He didn't meet Mavis's eyes. He just looked at Ghost, nodded once, and turned away. The gesture was small, but in a field where ego ruled, it echoed. A tactical review expert released a frame-by-frame analysis only minutes later, highlighting that Ghost had made 5 split-second decisions that had de-escalated what would have otherwise required backup, medics, and, most likely, lawsuits. He didn't just hold back, the expert wrote. He corrected for human overreach. Parents in the crowd began ushering their children back, but no one moved fast. They moved slowly, as if reluctant to break the moment's integrity. Several looked over their shoulders, not in fear, but in respect, as if they had just seen something divine dressed in fur and discipline. Mavis finally moved, walking with Ghost beside her. They did not rush. They did not flee. They passed through the field like veterans returning from war, with not a single shot fired, just purpose strategy, and restraint. A young officer muttered to no one, "We're not trained for that." His superior, the lieutenant who had earlier watched without intervening, said softly, "No, but maybe we should be." The footage went viral in less than 20 minutes. Not because it was violent, but because it wasn't. Commentators couldn't stop replaying the takedown. 0.7 seconds of clean intervention with zero bloodshed. They began calling it the Ghost Second. Mavis reached the sidewalk, and Ghost paused before stepping off the grass. Not out of hesitation, but protocol. Awaiting civilian re-entry clearance, Mavis tapped her leg once. Ghost followed. Behind them, the officers who once assumed superiority now stood in loose, uncertain formation. No one spoke, not because they were gagged, but because they had been shown something they didn't know how to name. One journalist wrote, "He didn't bark because he didn't need to. That wasn't a submission. That was dominance refined by discipline." The story would be told in schools, rewritten in books, and referenced in debates. But in that moment, all anyone knew was this: something had changed. Not just in the air, not just in that field, but in how power was defined. Because in 0.7 seconds, Ghost didn't just stop a threat. He recalibrated the concept of response. And he never raised his voice because he didn't need to. That's what Mavis had trained him for. From that moment on, the term ghost time began circulating beyond headlines. Military analysts, behavioral psychologists, and even legal theorists began citing it not as myth but as precedent. The speed of engagement wasn't the revelation. It was the clarity within it. In under a second, Ghost made 5 distinct decisions: redirect, neutralize, protect, de-escalate, and withdraw, each with surgical restraint. A university ethics professor tweeted, "Ghost redefined proportionality. What we just saw wasn't canine instinct, it was applied morality in motion." In D.C., a silent clip of the takedown was replayed on a monitor during a closed-session briefing. A general leaned back, arms folded, and muttered, "I've got captains who couldn't pull that off." But none of that mattered to Ghost, or to Mavis. They didn't stop to comment. They didn't sign statements. They didn't give interviews. They walked the rest of the path in silence, dog and handler, warrior and witness. As they disappeared beyond the playground, a voice behind them, young, amazed, broke the stillness one last time. "Do you think he knew he was being recorded?" Someone replied, "No, but I think he knew he was being remembered." And in that knowing, Ghost never looked back, because legends don't check the footage, they become it. Legends don't check the footage, they become it. And as Mavis and Ghost crossed the invisible boundary between incident and memory, the crowd parted not because they were afraid, but because they finally understood who they had been standing in front of. They hadn't just witnessed restraint, they'd witnessed command, and command has its gravity. A hush still clung to the scene like residue from a storm, thick and heavy with revelation, when a black sedan rolled silently into view. It didn't blare, didn't flash. It stopped at the curb like a final punctuation mark. The door opened and a man stepped out. No armor, no weapon. Just stripes, just stillness. He was a senior officer, not by age but by atmosphere. The kind of presence that made even chaos straighten its back. His eyes scanned the scene, fallen officers, stunned civilians, the unwavering canine beside a woman who had neither spoken loudly nor moved abruptly, and he understood. No need for questions. Only confirmation. Mavis turned as if she had already sensed his arrival. She didn't nod, didn't salute. She reached into her coat, pulled something round and flat from the inner pocket, and let the metal gleam catch the sun. She held it up, not to prove, but to remind. "Federal Canine Combat Unit," she said, and let the weight of it hang between them. Then, softer, quieter, but no less potent, "Retired Commander." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Ghost straightened beside her, body still, head aligned, tail silent. His posture was not one of attention. It was of allegiance. The badge didn't sparkle. It glared. It was not a token, not a memento. It was a command encapsulated in metal. Its edges were clean, unbent. It had seen more battlefields than most of the men now watching had ever studied. Around its circumference were the letters that turned silence into law. No action permitted in presence of command retired. The senior officer, recognizing it, did not hesitate. He took one step forward, removed his cap, and stood at full attention. Not for ceremony, for recognition. "Ma'am," he said. "Just that, no apologies yet, no exposition, just acknowledgement." Behind him, a ripple passed through the younger officers like a current. One muttered, "She's one of them." Another whispered, "Why the hell didn't anyone check ID?" But the words were hollow. It was too late for protocol. Respect had replaced regulation. A voice rose from the far end of the onlooking crowd, gravelly and dry, but unwavering. "That's the Bronze Star lady," the man said. "I saw her picture in the archives back at Fort Carson. That's Mavis Hampton. 17 years of K-9 tactical leadership. Ghost was her final project." The words struck like confirmation bias turned divine. The live stream viewer count surged. 50,000, then 51. Screens filled with screen caps of the badge, zoomed in and enhanced, parsed through facial recognition. Threads exploded. She was buried in the system. They knew and did nothing. Ghost was never just a dog. Ghost, hearing the phrase "final project," shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, then lowered his head. Not in defeat, in ritual. Mavis placed her palm gently on his neck and whispered, audible only to the two of them, "It's done." He didn't whine. He didn't move. He just froze in perfect acknowledgement. The air changed, not like wind, but like a shift in gravity. What had moments ago been a perimeter of doubt was now a formation of reverence. Officers who had looked at Mavis like a civilian now stood with the rigidity of enlisted ranks. Their weapons hung lower, their postures adjusted. No one had ordered it, but the structure had returned, not through command, but through example. Ghost remained motionless, and yet every muscle in his frame communicated readiness. Not for a fight, for stand-down, for the ceremony, for closure. It was in the angle of his spine, the stillness of his tail, the way his paws never shifted even once on the pavement. He was still protecting her, but now from misunderstanding, not danger. The senior officer stepped closer, voice lowering as if afraid to break the sacred geometry now hanging in the air. "We weren't told," he said. "No one briefed us. The badge was deactivated in our protocols." Mavis didn't blink. "That was your mistake." He lowered his eyes. "Permission to correct that, Commander?" She didn't nod. She simply closed her hand around the badge and tucked it back inside her coat. The crowd didn't applaud. Applause would have cheapened it. Instead, they held their breath, as if afraid that even oxygen might disrespect the moment. One journalist whispered to their producer, "Don't cut, just hold. This is history." The live stream ticked past 60,000. A mother in the crowd looked down at her daughter and said, "That woman didn't just train the dog, she trained the room." Mavis finally spoke, not to the crowd, not to the officers, but to Ghost. One word: rest. Ghost's body eased, barely perceptible to anyone except her. His shoulders softened, but his posture never lost its discipline. He had received the final command and obeyed, not with fatigue, but with fulfillment. Rest didn't mean retreat. It meant mission accomplished. The senior officer took a single step back and turned to face his own men. "Holster," he said. One word. Every weapon returned to its place. Slowly, quietly, with the shame of men who had drawn steel in the presence of someone who wielded far more without ever needing it. From the far corner, a small group of veterans, grizzled, silent, saluted. They hadn't spoken since arriving. Now, one of them stepped forward and laid something on the grass. An old patch, faded by time. Federal K-9 insignia. He didn't say who it belonged to. He didn't need to. Ghost walked to it, sniffed once, then sat beside it like a sentry rediscovering his post. A teenager live streaming on a cracked phone whispered to her viewers, "I think we just saw a dog command an entire precinct." Her comments flooded with agreement, emojis, and disbelief, but no one laughed. The officer who had first mocked Ghost's leash stepped forward, swallowing hard. He didn't apologize. An apology wouldn't have matched the damage. But he did something harder. He saluted Mavis, then lowered his head and backed away. Mavis didn't return the salute. She simply looked through him, past him. She was no longer talking to them. She had said everything in silence, in movement, in refusal to yield. The badge had done its work. Now the silence was theirs to carry. And Ghost, as if reading that truth in the air, finally closed his eyes. He didn't need to watch anymore. He had already seen it all. The footage from the scene was already being clipped and circulated with headlines that varied in tone but shared one undeniable truth. Power had entered the frame and no longer wore a uniform. A retired commander, a silent dog, and a badge no one had thought to remember had undone layers of presumption in less than a minute. One major network superimposed the moment Mavis raised the badge against a backdrop of muted blue and gold, the caption beneath it reading, "Authority does not expire." Within hours, think tanks issued statements. Scholars began drafting opinion pieces. Commanders in quiet offices stared at protocol sheets that suddenly looked incomplete. But Mavis wasn't watching. She didn't need to see the response. She had issued her own. A child in the crowd, eyes wide, turned to his father. "Can a dog be a hero?" he asked. The father knelt, hand on the boy's shoulder. "Only if someone teaches it how, them." That was the moment Ghost opened his eyes again. Not to assess, not to react, but because it was safe to witness what had changed. The officer who had once flinched now stood still, no longer hiding behind his vest, as if finally understanding that defense wasn't about barriers, but behavior. A subtle nod passed between him and the senior officer. No words were exchanged, because this wasn't a debrief. It was the aftermath. And through it all, Mavis didn't move. She remained where she stood, one hand on the leash, the other tucked in her coat, the badge close to her chest. She wasn't hiding it. She wasn't brandishing it. She was simply letting it exist, like a truth that no longer needed permission to be present. And for the first time that day, every person in that park stood on equal ground, not because they were the same rank, but because they finally knew who they were. The sun had shifted by then, casting long, deliberate shadows across the ground where chaos had nearly bloomed but never flowered. Light struck the badge through the folds of Mavis's coat, a thin golden glint leaking through fabric like a buried flare. It didn't blind anyone, but it reminded everyone. In the days to come, journalists would call this moment the command reversal. Editors would argue about terminology, whether Ghost was an enforcer, a defender, or something new. Political commentators would debate Mavis's silence as a strategy or defiance. None of it mattered, because in that clearing, with the scent of dust and restraint still hanging in the air, nothing was spoken, yet everything was settled. A younger officer, rookie judging by his uncertain hands, approached slowly, his gaze locked, not on Ghost, not on Mavis, but on the patch the veteran had left on the grass. He knelt, touched it gently, then stood and saluted it. Not theatrically, not for cameras, just for clarity. Ghost didn't move. Mavis's hand tightened slightly on the leash, and the crowd, as if cued by some internal hush, began to disperse. Not because they were dismissed, but because they knew the moment was complete. By the time the sun had dipped far enough to leave the badge in shadow again, Mavis and Ghost were walking toward the exit path, not leading, not fleeing, simply concluding. Behind them, a journalist murmured, "She never raised her voice." A producer replied, "No, but she raised the standard." And that was the legacy left on that field. Not footprints, not a command, but calibration. Because real power doesn't announce itself. It arrives, corrects, and leaves the rest remembering silence as the loudest part. She never raised her voice, but within the hour, the world was shouting for her. By the time Mavis and Ghost reached the end of the block, the first clip had already gone viral. A 38-second snippet, trimmed from a shaky live stream, showed Ghost disarming one officer, disabling another, and pinning a third, all without barking. It was raw, it was real, It was irrefutable. It passed 100,000 views in 47 minutes. By the end of the hour, it was playing on news loops in 5 cities. A major network ran it on split screen, one side showing the original body cam footage leaked anonymously, the other replaying the live stream with zoomed-in slow motion. Analysts were brought in before the footage even finished rolling. Tactical experts outlined Ghost's trajectory. Canine behaviorists were asked if this was an instinct. No one could say yes. One commentator leaned forward and said flatly, "That wasn't a reaction. That was protocol." The department scrambled. A press conference was arranged in a glass-walled briefing room. The spokesperson, a captain whose tie had been adjusted too many times, opened with a line that landed like a trapdoor. "There was no misconduct," he said. "What occurred was a misunderstanding. Everything is under control." The room fell quiet. Reporters scribbled without looking up. One asked, "Was the subject's badge verified?" Another, "Did the officers know they were confronting a retired federal canine unit?" The captain smiled too tightly. "We're reviewing the full context, but..." The clip behind him kept playing. Then came the first rebuttal. A grainy video posted by a grizzled man with sunburnt skin and eyes like old gravel. His background was a wall covered in medals. His tone was colder than steel. "Ghost didn't act wrong," he said. "If Ghost moved, it's because someone forgot what justice looks like." The video from the veteran spread almost as fast as the original clip. His credentials were impossible to dismiss. Former K-9 Master Sergeant, deployed twice with Ghost's unit. His name appeared in old declassified mission reports, often next to Mavis's. His final line in the video cut through every attempt at PR containment. "I served with that dog. If he reacted, it was because his instincts were trained to detect violations. Not dangerous, violations." A major newspaper's front page ran with the headline, "Ghost didn't strike, he corrected." Social media followed in waves. One user posted a still frame from the clip, Ghost standing squarely between Mavis and her granddaughter, body tight, head lowered. The caption, "Silent resistance." Another viral comment simply read, "He didn't attack the system, he revealed it." Underneath the storm of opinion, something quieter but more powerful leaked. A screenshot of an internal memo, marked "Confidential," circulated through backdoor email chains. The subject line, URGN, pull back active engagement. The body of the email contained only 12 words. Disengage all further field actions. Risk of PR inversion, hold statements. It was signed, Chief of Operations. That one leak undid every word of the press conference. One reporter read the memo aloud during a live panel. Another cut back to the footage of Mavis holding the badge. A third played a slowed-down moment where Ghost paused before striking, visibly measuring his distance, adjusting his angle, sparing the man's ribs by millimeters. "This isn't just a tactical decision," a legal analyst said. "It's proof of discretion." The story spread beyond news outlets. Editorial cartoons portrayed Ghost in 1,000 poses. Blocking, watching, restraining, none showed him with teeth bared. One simply had him sitting calmly while chaos ran behind him. Its caption, "Order isn't loud." Back channels lit up across precincts and legal offices alike. Law professors began streaming real-time breakdowns of the incident. "You're not watching a dog subdue officers," one said into the camera. "You're watching a system check itself through a trained proxy. That's why it hurts. That's why it's spreading." Hashtags evolved. From Ghost Protocol to Disarm by Design, some demanded Ghost be given a medal. Others insisted that the entire training curriculum be rewritten around his conduct. Nobody was asking who he bit. They were asking why no one else had stopped things sooner. A satirical late-night segment aired a parody where political leaders were replaced by dogs trained to pause before barking. The punchline landed without laughter. Too true, too recent, too sharp. Another program simply showed the footage. No commentary, no filter, just Ghost moving between chaos and correction with surgical clarity. The anchor closed with, "No matter how loud the room, silence still leads. Some in law enforcement began speaking anonymously. We weren't told who she was. We didn't expect a unit dog to still hold protocol. Honestly, we thought the leash was just symbolic. That word, symbolic, was dissected relentlessly. It wasn't symbolic, it was systemic. It was a rule, not a ritual, and in the center of it, one image surged above all. Ghost, poised in front of Mavis and her granddaughter, eyes alert, muscles steady, facing the camera. Someone overlaid text, "Do not mistake stillness for permission." It became a protest poster overnight, then a screensaver, then a banner outside the law schools. A final message came quietly, almost missed. An off-duty officer, watching the clip alone in his car, typed a comment on a barely active thread. No hashtags, no capital letters, just 5 words. "He made me stop lying." That was the end of it. Not because the story died, but because the truth had finally spoken, and it sounded exactly like silence. By the following morning, international outlets had picked up the story. In Germany, a news anchor called Ghost the quietest riot ever unleashed. In Japan, a think tank released a paper titled Authority in 4 Legs, Behavioral Ethics Beyond Species. The footage reached over 2 million views. Ghost was trending higher than any politician, celebrity, or global crisis that week. But this wasn't a celebrity. It was the consequence. Back at the precinct, desks were filled with inquiries, subpoenas, and media requests. Internal Affairs launched parallel investigations, not into Mavis or Ghost, but into the officers who had engaged without identification, who had escalated without cause, who had forgotten that power has memory. One officer quietly took leave, another resigned. The third issued a formal statement that read, less like a defense and more like a confession. Meanwhile, across schools, students analyzed Ghost's footage frame by frame. One classroom compared his response timing to that of trained soldiers. Another noted his pivot angles, how he moved not toward the threat, but toward alignment. "He never moved forward unless someone else crossed the line," a student said. The teacher paused, then added, "And that's how you tell the difference between defense and domination." Memes emerged, sure, but none made light. Instead, they reframed justice. A comic strip depicted Ghost in various world conflicts, stopping fists before they landed, intercepting orders before they turned unjust. In each panel, he never spoke. The final caption, "You don't need volume to be heard." By evening, one final message leaked, a short single-sentence command sent across district servers. "Cease commentary. Protocol 9. Silence remains our only shield." And so, the story ended, not with a bang, but with a breath, and every institution left gasping for one. That breath rippled outward. In city halls and command centers, silent clips of Ghost's restraint played on loop. No commentary, no dramatic music, just kinetic truth. Police trainers rewound the moment his paw stopped mid-lunge, freezing just above an officer's knee. Military panels requested full behavioral logs, only to discover most of Ghost's records had been classified or purged. What remained was reputation, and reputation, when paired with precision, was more explosive than any briefing memo. At a civil liberties forum, a professor wrote Ghost's name on a whiteboard and circled it. "This," he said, "is not about a dog. It's about a response system more ethical than its environment. That's what makes this dangerous for the people who mistake force for justice." Students nodded. Activists reprinted posters. Journalists stopped asking for quotes. Instead, they wrote retrospectives. Headlines like, "The Dog Who Taught Us Boundaries," or "Power Without Noise," "The Ghost Doctrine." A book deal was rumored. A documentary trailer dropped, but none of it featured Mavis's voice. Not a sentence, not a soundbite. She had returned home with Ghost, closed her door, turned down every interview, because everything that needed saying had already stood still in front of them all. A still frame from the footage was nominated for a journalism award. Ghost, head lowered, standing between uniformed men and a child, in lavender. That single image was printed and placed in a courthouse lobby. Below it, etched in silver, "Do not confuse silence with surrender. It is sometimes the last form of command." Elsewhere, in a room far from any camera or podium, a closed-door meeting convened. Senior advisors, city attorneys, public liaisons, they didn't speak loudly. They couldn't afford to. On the screen before them, paused at frame 24, Ghost's paw, inches from contact, never making it. Someone exhaled. Another whispered, "We trained humans to be decisive, but we forgot to train them to know when not." No vote was held, but decisions were made. Internal policies shifted quietly. One memo changed the wording from use of necessary force to recognition of restraint. Another outlined new protocols. If a badge like Mavis's was presented, all field response must defer unless a direct threat was visible, not because she won, but because Ghost showed them how close losing could have been. At midnight, a judge signed an order to seal the incident, pending federal review, not to bury it, but to protect it from being twisted. And the final post of the night, from an anonymous legal intern, captured it best. When the system met a dog that obeyed higher ethics than its officers, it broke, not from violence, but from the sound of everything it had forgotten. By dawn, no one called Ghost a pet. They called him the Standard, and standards don't bark. They endure. They called him the Standard, and standards, once revealed, don't retreat. They ripple. Just hours after Ghost's image was etched into courthouse glass, another tremor began to spread. Not a rumor, a record. A military document leaked to a veterans forum. Redacted, weathered, but legible. Mavis Hampton, rank commander. Division Federal K-9 Combat Unit. Posting Fort Carson. Deployment Afghanistan, Kandahar Forward Ops. Status honorably retired. Subsection highlighted, training lead for Silent Protocol K-9 units, high conflict engagement zones, badge level clearance. A3, non-aggression override. That last phrase tore through the thread like fire under glass. Badge level clearance. Not ceremonial, not symbolic, a designation used only during wartime, meant for operatives whose authority could override standing orders during live conflict scenarios. It was never meant to be used domestically, but there it was, still valid, still real. Forums lit up. Security experts began threading the implications. Maisel hadn't simply stepped into that park with a dog and a leash. She had entered with a badge designed to halt combat itself, and it worked. Not because of nostalgia, because of code. An old precinct captain, long retired, broke silence in a podcast interview. His voice was gravel-soaked in regret. "We phased those badges out," he said. "Told ourselves they were relics, that we'd never need to pause the force again. But people like Mavis, they never saw the war end, because for them, it doesn't. The battlefield is wherever log gets twisted. The red light blink was no accident." In specialized K-9 units, that stud signaled a full behavioral override, an emergency stop encoded only between handler and dog, a command of trust, of calibration, of consequence. And in that public square, it worked more effectively than any loudspeaker or riot shield ever could. Clips of that second, her touch, his pause, were now shown side by side with courtroom reenactments and training simulations. Professors paused lectures to show it. Law enforcement agencies debated reviving the badge classification, but the question rang louder than any procedural talk. Why had it ever been shelved? Social feeds are flooded with one answer after another. A tweet from a young woman went viral. "We stopped issuing badges like hers because we feared calm more than chaos." Another added, "Mavis Hampton carried the one thing systems hate most, memory." Meanwhile, in universities, legal clinics dissected the footage. One group of law students released a formal paper on social media, citing the U.S. Civilian Self-Defense Clause and comparing Mavis's leash pull to a proportional deterrent maneuver. Their conclusion? No excessive force was used. Instead, measured force was withheld. The phrasing spread like gospel. Pinned posts, #curriculum module. And still, Mavis said nothing until one clip surfaced, unplanned. Caught on his cell phone by someone delivering groceries near her gate. A reporter, respectful but insistent, had tried one last time. "Ma'am," he asked, "do you plan to sue?" Mavis paused, her face unreadable. Then she answered with 7 words that landed like cold steel. "I don't sue people, I train them." The camera shook, the feed cut, but the quote echoed louder than any lawsuit. Ghost sat beside her, head level, unmoved, the leash never even tensed. Soon, the phrase itself became doctrine. "I don't sue people, I train them." It appeared on murals, was quoted in debates, and even whispered in courtrooms. Not a threat, as a correction, as memory, as a reassertion of control through restraint. A prominent civil rights attorney posted a clip of Ghost mid-pause, tagging it with, "Most of us lash out. Only one stopped." It gained traction because no one could argue. There was no brutality, no blood, no panic. Only interruption, timed, targeted, absolute. Ghost had become the embodiment of what it meant to stop before the line. Not because you were afraid, but because you understood where it was. Elsewhere, deeper truths rose. Retired trainers confirmed that Mavis had developed the silent hold protocol herself, a system based not on reaction, but on layered observation and discretion. One document, pulled from an old K-9 instructor manual, described her method as combat patience. Another labeled her dogs as civil guardians trained in militant empathy, and that term stuck. Militant empathy. It didn't mean soft. It meant surgical, tactical, intentional. Meanwhile, in policy circles, the badge classification was formally reviewed. A task force reopened the A3 file. Minutes from the session were leaked. We forgot we had a code for nonviolence leadership. Maybe it's time we remembered. Lawmakers debated adding the Ghost case to ethics modules for law enforcement. One representative said he didn't challenge authority. He clarified it. Even now, no charges had been filed. Not against Mavis, not against Ghost, because there was nothing to try. What they had done wasn't just legal, it was necessary. And through it all, Mavis remained out of frame. But her shadow grew longer, and her silence now came with a badge. In the months that followed, Mavis's file became case study material. It wasn't just read, it was dissected, debated, highlighted in ink and memory. Her record wasn't spotless, it was scorched in discipline. Every reprimand she'd ever received came from refusing shortcuts. Every commendation was earned for refusing escalation. In one document, a field commander had written, "Hampton's units respond slower, but only because they're listening longer." Another note, almost dismissed by a clerk, resurfaced. "If she's quiet, wait, she's already ahead." Students at police academies were now quoting Ghost's stance like it was scripture. Knees low, lines square, threat behind, not ahead. It wasn't about fighting. It was about filtering, knowing when presence itself was enough. The badge Mavis carried, once thought ornamental, was now featured in updated manuals. A 3 non-aggression override. Underneath it, not obsolete, just too rare. Across town, someone painted a mural 4 stories tall, Ghost, in silhouette, between a child and a riot line. Above him, "Protection is precision," and beside it, in looping text that echoed like doctrine, "We always taught loyalty. He chose justice." In Senate chambers, a motion was tabled to review federal K-9 retirement protocol. The suggestion was quiet. Don't just discharge veterans. Ask what they've seen. Ask what they remember. Ask what they can still teach. One senator said, "We threw away our brakes," and Ghost reminded us we still had a steering wheel. Yet even as institutions adjusted, none of it touched Mavis. She returned to her garden, walked Ghost at dawn, never flinched at cameras, never commented. But one morning someone left a note on her fence. No signature, just a line handwritten in neat cursive. "You didn't stop them. You stopped us from becoming them." Mavis folded it once and fed it to the fire pit. Ghost sat nearby, watching, as always, in total silence. Later that week, in a private training seminar for elite K-9 units, an instructor held up a still image from the now iconic footage. Ghost, eyes steady, muscles ready, not lunging, just waiting. She addressed the room. This isn't hesitation, this is a hierarchy. This is respect channeled into stillness. If your dog can do this, you haven't trained him to fight. You've trained him to think. And in that statement, something shifted. Around the world, agencies quietly requested access to archived footage, manuals authored by Mavis, behavioral frameworks she'd once submitted and been ignored for. They weren't asking for weaponry. They were asking for wisdom, for the kind of power that didn't explode, but steadied. And when Mavis looked out her window that night, Ghost at her feet, not barking, not sleeping, just being. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The world had remembered her badge, and this time it wouldn't forget so easily. Across training grounds and precinct basements, instructors adjusted drills. No longer just go on command, but wait under pressure. A single directive from a new national guideline circulated in bold. The purpose of force is not to act, it is to prevent action when none is justified. An internal agency memorandum titled Operation Reframe listed Ghost's pause as a case reference. Next to it, a citation for unarmed interruption, attributed not to a policy or bill, but to a handler's precision. And finally, from a high-rise office of a policy review board, an executive summary was quietly signed and filed. It didn't propose a new law. It recorded one line, already lived. She enforced without exerting. He obeyed without reacting. Together, they reminded us what control is supposed to look like. By the time dusk settled across the city that made them famous, there were no sirens, no parades, no final broadcasts. Only a woman sipping from a tin cup, only a dog beside her ears was twitching, but its body was still. They had never tried to be symbols, but in a time when noise ruled everything, they had become the loudest silence the world had ever heard, and they left it ringing. They had become the loudest silence the world had ever heard, and in that stillness, the world kept staring, hoping for a sound that never came. 3 days after the footage stopped circulating and policy boards finalized their memos, Ghost was quietly relocated under escort to the Federal K-9 Training Center outside Denver. No press, no parades. Just a convoy without sirens, and a signature that bore no title, just the initials M.H. Mavis did not go with him. She didn't need to. He knew where to wait. The facility hadn't changed much. Same perimeter walls, same gray gravel lots, same surveillance poles watching everything and understanding nothing. But this time, it wasn't a trainee returning. It was an anomaly. For 3 straight hours, Ghost was tested. Trainers cycled through a litany of commands. Sit, track, defend, hold. Not once did his posture shift. Not once did he so much as twitch. Eyes forward, ears sharp, body still. It was not a rebellion. It was rejection, and it rattled them. He's not shut down, the behaviorist said, lips pursed as she studied the monitor. He's selecting. This is not defiance, it's filtration. He's parsing for a voice he recognizes, and he's not hearing it. Outside, technicians watched the feed and said nothing. Inside the control room, someone finally turned off the audio channel. There was no need for commands when the subject had rendered them irrelevant. Ghost sat in the center of the concrete yard, facing east, as though expecting the sun to answer. His breath was even, his spine aligned, and his pause never shifted. 3 hours became 4. One trainer whispered, "He's not just ignoring us, he's waiting." Another added, "For whom?" The answer was in the direction of his gaze, toward the closed door of the review chamber. Mavis wasn't inside, but her presence was. Inside the chamber, behind mirrored glass, 3 officers sat across from legal advisors, their suits too crisp for comfort. They didn't speak in anger, they spoke in defeat, in disbelief, in something colder than regret. "I'm not suing the dog," one said. I'm filing against the state, against the way she looked at me like I'd already failed a test I didn't know I was taking. Another said, she didn't raise her voice, she didn't even lift her chin, but it was like standing in front of a verdict. The third officer tapped a pen on the table, not in rhythm, but in retreat. I had command authority, he muttered, but when she looked at me, I didn't feel authorized to exist. The legal team said little. They didn't need to. The silence between sentences was more telling than the words themselves. Down the hall, the veterinary psychologist submitted a report. 4 lines, typed with clinical restraint. Subject does not respond to new stimulus. The subject remains physiologically stable. The subject demonstrates conditional loyalty override. Unprecedented. A post-it note beneath the printed report read, whatever she built, still listens only to her. That's not conditioning, that's conviction. By the 6th hour, a rumor began to spread through the lower corridors of the facility. Quiet. Like a virus without symptoms. No one said it outright, but everyone felt it. Ghost was holding a trial, and they were all defendants. Someone pulled footage from his last deployment, hoping for behavioral clues. It showed Ghost in a desert zone, standing between 2 warring factions, unmoved by gunfire, only moving when Mavis raised 2 fingers. She hadn't spoken then, either. The psychologist revised her report. Subject displays signal latency rejection, absence of auditory cue recognition. Subject appears to reject authority, not based on volume, but on value. She underlined the final word. Meanwhile, one of the officers filed a supplemental claim. It wasn't about trauma, it was about implication. When that dog looked at me, he wrote, I felt I was being measured, not attacked. I don't know what standard I was being held to, only that I didn't meet it. His attorney tried to pivot. This is about undue psychological impact. But the board remained unmoved. They had seen the footage too. There was no bite, no bruise, only that pause, that gaze. A leaked message from an aide to the agency director summed it up in 13 clipped words. Whoever trained this is holding more leverage than biological weaponry ever could. Ghost didn't move. He didn't sleep. He didn't blink unless wind touched his ear. But when a door opened 4 floors up, just a creak, just a hinge, he turned his head. His tail thudded once, then nothing. In a different wing, an ethics panel began debate. Could loyalty this precise be dangerous? Could obedience tuned too finely threaten autonomy? One philosopher said, we've taught machines to wait for inputs. She taught a living being to wait for meaning. A new report circulated under high clearance. Behavioral sovereignty, non-transferable compliance. Ghost was not programmable. He was relational. That made him rare and unpredictable. It became impossible to focus inside the building. Even the dogs in training barked less. Handlers whispered around Ghost's name like it belonged to a myth, not a file. Someone tried to joke, he's not a dog, he's a doctrine. No one laughed. Eventually, a new trainer was flown in, a decorated specialist from overseas. Fluent in canine behavior, combat psychology, and high-pressure diffusion, she entered the enclosure with no leash, no command, just quiet observation. For 20 minutes, she stood 10 feet from Ghost, who didn't flinch. Finally, she whispered, "You were never trained to obey. You were trained to discern." He blinked once. She stepped back. Her report? 3 words. He passed me. That same day, 2 of the original officers who'd filed counterclaims officially withdrew them. No press release, no press. One was seen pacing outside headquarters before removing his badge and leaving it on a stone ledge. She didn't fight me, he muttered to a colleague. She just left me no place to stand. The final one refused to recant, but his statement grew cryptic. I wasn't injured, he wrote. I was revealed. He never returned to duty. By week's end, the directorate ruled that Ghost would not be reconditioned. It would be unethical. You do not override a code of justice more flawless than ours, the decision read. You study it. A formal request was drafted. Permission to document Ghost's non-researchin as a benchmark for moral calibration in future fieldwork, not as an anomaly, aspiration. Ghost was brought back to the same yard. He lay down, not in fatigue, in peace. He never looked behind him, only toward the door, only toward the silence that trained him. In a closed-door debrief, the director of psychological operations tapped the top of Ghost's profile file and said, "We didn't break him. That's what scares me." Around the table, no one replied. The fear wasn't about what Ghost might do. It was about what he'd made them see. That silence could convict, that discipline could expose, that absence of action could be more devastating than aggression. A week later, Mavis arrived. No announcement, no briefing. She walked through security with no badge, no weapon, only her presence. Staff parted like fog. No one greeted her. No one dared. She walked past the gates, across the concrete yard, and stopped 6 feet from Ghost. He stood. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He exhaled. And then, for the first time in 11 days, he moved, 1 step forward, nose to her hand, then sat by her side, like nothing had passed between them except the world. A technician behind the glass began to cry. One handler whispered, "We thought we were evaluating him. Turns out, he was evaluating us." Mavis stayed 1 hour. She didn't speak. She didn't ask for reports. She didn't sign anything. When she turned to leave, Ghost didn't follow. He stayed seated, eyes forward, posture locked. Her final test was clear. Would he stay even when she walked away? He did, because she had taught him that true loyalty is not measured by following, but by knowing when not to. The final panel report declared Ghost's condition non-compliant by design, non-aggressive by principle, non-corruptible by environment. They concluded with one recommendation: Ghost shall remain unaltered. He is not to be decommissioned, he is to be understood. Weeks passed. Ghost remained in the yard, a quiet sentinel. He did not pace, he did not engage. He was neither waiting nor withdrawn. He was holding space, an act more powerful than command. Young handlers began requesting shifts near his perimeter, not to train him, to learn. A quiet curriculum emerged, unspoken but deeply felt. How to exist without noise, how to observe without judgment, how to trust silence as a signal. A memo from the Department of Behavioral Command suggested formalizing the practice. They called it presence discipline, and cited Ghost not as an outlier, but as the origin point. The heading read, Standard 0. Meanwhile, a small plaque was mounted near the edge of the observation yard. No name, no rank, no story, just a single line. The one who stayed. One morning, a trainee, barely 20, stood across the enclosure and whispered, "If he's not listening to us, what is he listening to?" The answer came not in bark nor motion. It came in stillness that deepened. Because Ghost wasn't ignoring them, he was reminding them they hadn't earned his ears yet, and that was the truest silence of all. Justice, it turned out, knew how to wait quietly. What followed was not a protest, not outrage. It was something worse: stillness. Offices that once buzzed with mission briefings now hummed with the weight of unread truths. No one could say they didn't know. Now they did. Screens flashed with excerpts of the memos Mavis had signed, the edits she had crossed out, the silent war she had fought years ago beneath classified ceilings. At the Pentagon, a closed-door meeting grew tense. One general threw the report across the table. She didn't just refuse. She documented us while we erased her. A deputy nodded, jaw tight. And now every step we silenced is printed and pinned in real time across 200,000 screens. Meanwhile, social media locked onto one line, refused, stated, "I train for protection, not prejudice." It was inked across protest banners, etched into training center lockers, whispered inside night shifts between young cadets. She had said it, and now they couldn't unsay it. The Ghost had returned to his pacing, not erratic but circular. He walked in a measured loop every night between the speaker box and the far end of the yard, one rotation, then a pause, then stillness. It was as if he wasn't marching but marking time, and everyone who watched it understood. He wasn't forgetting. He was waiting for the rest of them to catch up. A second leak struck days later. Internal emails. Subject, non-compliance, discharged Hampton. One thread read, "She's a liability. Won't follow unethical command. Remove quietly." Another responded, "Make it about her methods. Frame her as outdated. Bury it in red tape." Beneath those words a staffer scribbled, "Ghost won't unlearn her, so we'll isolate him." But they had failed. Ghost hadn't forgotten, and the silence she left behind had turned to stone. The silence she left behind had turned to stone, but stone, too, could be carved. Weeks after the files shook the system and Ghost's stillness became scripture, a glossy new ad campaign appeared across every major platform. Clean fonts, high contrast, a sleek logo melting into an American flag, and front and center, Ghost, except it wasn't. It was a CGI rendering, too symmetrical, too sterile. His fur had no scarring, no wear. His eyes, disturbingly, were blue. The slogan, honor, obey, protect, the brand. LexCorp Tactical, a multinational defense conglomerate. The reaction, immediate outrage. Within hours, social media burned with fury. Hashtags erupted. "Ghost is not yours. Do not commodify. Do not your symbol." One reply thread read, "That dog didn't obey. He decided." Another, "They turned a warning into a mascot." A viral video emerged of Ghost watching the commercial on a rec room screen. Midway through, the CGI version snapped to attention, its synthetic eyes flaring. Ghost, the real one, turned his head away, not in fear, in dismissal. The room watching him went dead silent. One cadet whispered, "He knows, and he hates it." An acclaimed novelist tweeted, "They're trying to brand dissent, wrap it in uniforms, sell it in boxes. But this isn't loyalty, it's looting." When asked about the ad during a short interview outside her garden gate, Mavis didn't raise her voice or her hand. She just smiled faintly and said, "Justice doesn't come in prepackaged colors, and no one holds it in their palm." The reporter pressed further, "But it's your image, your moment. Do you feel robbed?" She shook her head. "You can't steal what isn't for sale. You can't steal what isn't for sale, but you can summon it to testify." The hearing was called special in name, but everyone knew it was damage control dressed in ceremony. Held in a wood-paneled room where history often whispered too softly, this time the silence roared. At the center, under harsh lights and thin politeness, sat Mavis Hampton. No uniform, no medals, just her. Composed, spine straight, gaze steady. Ghost lay at her feet like a statue cast in restraint. Cameras rolled. Senators postured. The chairman cleared his throat, already irritated that she hadn't touched the water in front of her. "Ms. Hampton, we're here to seek clarity. Your refusal to answer will only complicate perceptions." Mavis didn't blink. She didn't speak. Instead, she placed a black USB drive on the table, sliding it forward until it clicked against the mic base. A staffer reached for it. A technician plugged it in. The screen behind the dais lit up. What played next silenced the room. 17 minutes of internal briefings. Unredacted. Voices of officers commanding reactivity drills. Language stripped of ethics. Orders spoken with chilling precision. Escalate based on subject profile. Urban markers receive a Tier 2 response. No hesitation. Another clip. Handler override acceptable if subject fits deviation code. Assume threat. No one spoke. Ghost didn't move. Only Mavis breathed. A senator finally snapped. Rising from his chair, voice cracking beneath false thunder, "Do you know what you've done? You've set fire to a framework this nation relies on." Mavis looked at him. Calm, clear, razor sharp. "I didn't start the fire. I'm just showing you where it's still burning." She leaned back in her chair, said nothing else, and Ghost, unmoving, let out a single exhale. Measured, slow, as if releasing the weight of a decade in one breath. She leaned back in her chair, said nothing else, and Ghost, unmoving, let out a single exhale. Measured, slow, as if releasing the weight of a decade in one breath. That breath, somehow, kept moving into streets, classrooms, conversations, into children who were finally old enough to hear what hadn't been said aloud. In the months following the hearing, dozens of canine training centers across the country were shuttered for inspection. Some never reopened. Their gates rusted quietly beneath banners that once claimed discipline but had forgotten dignity. But while institutions stalled, something unexpected stirred at the margins. In a small converted library in the heart of Detroit, the first Know Your Dog, Know Your Rights class opened. It wasn't taught by officers. It was run by teenagers. Black, brown, immigrant, invisible. Kids who had seen too much and been believed too little. They didn't teach obedience. They taught observation. They studied posture, pauses, tension, tone. They watched Ghost not as a legend, but as a language. One morning, a blind girl arrived, led by her cousin. Ghost was lying near the back wall, still as ever. She knelt beside him, uncertain. Then she lifted her hand and gently placed it atop his head. He didn't flinch. He lowered his neck. He let her listen through her palm. The room did not applaud. The room simply breathed. Later, a boy with scuffed shoes and a bruised voice asked, "Could I ever give him a command like she did?" The teacher smiled. "Only if you learn when not to." That afternoon, Ghost lay in the center of a loose circle of folding chairs. The students didn't touch him. They spoke near him, around him. Every time one raised their voice in frustration, he blinked. But when a girl muttered something cruel, offhand, careless, he lifted his head just once, then stilled again. On the door, a handwritten sign hung from painter's tape. It read, "We don't train dogs. We relearn how to be human." The sign on the classroom door read, "We don't train dogs. We relearn how to be human." But even the relearning had to come from somewhere, and for Mavis, the past never knocked. It simply arrived. The envelope bore no return address. The handwriting was precise, military. Inside, the paper held no letterhead, no stamp of office, just words, clean and without decoration. "I once ordered you out because I feared your integrity more than the chaos above me." There was no apology in the structure, only in the weight of what was unsaid. Ghost sat beside her as she read, unmoving. His breathing was shallow, almost measured to the cadence of each sentence. "I buried you because you reminded me of what we were supposed to protect. If the system ever asks for you again, I hope you'll still choose to teach." She didn't cry. She didn't sigh. She folded the letter in three, slowly, with precision that echoed years of silent reports. She did not burn it. She did not achieve it. She left it at the threshold of the door. Ghost moved only once. He approached the wooden wall where her old commander's insignia hung beneath glass, untouched for years. He touched his nose to the lower edge, then sat, still, watching. A friend, one of the few who still visited her without questions, saw the letter later and said softly, "I've never seen you rise for an apology." Then he paused, but Ghost has been quiet all morning. Mavis didn't reply. She didn't need to. The silence around her had shifted, no longer a shield, but a decision waiting to be made. The silence around her had shifted, no longer a shield, but a decision waiting to be made. And when it came, it did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived with a question. Would she help rebuild what once betrayed her? The offer was formal. A government liaison, flanked by quiet aides, arrived with a folder and a plea. They asked her to return, not as a soldier, not as a symbol, but as a strategist, to help redesign the national K-9 program from the ground up. She listened, unmoved until they said the part that mattered, "On your term." Her condition was singular, non-negotiable. "I won't teach to strike," she said, "only to shield." They agreed. On the morning of the Reformation ceremony, Ghost walked ahead of the crowd, not led, not flanked, not restrained. The medal once pinned to Mavis's chest was now recast into a medallion on his collar, stamped with her old title, Retired Commander. He moved slowly down the concrete aisle. Rows of new cadets stood at attention, not saluting, just watching. Not one spoke. Not one blinked when Ghost paused midway, looked left, then kept going. Mavis stood at the edge of the platform. She did not climb the steps. She didn't need height to speak. "This isn't redemption," she said. "It's recalibration." A young officer stepped forward, nervous but bold. "Ma'am, He asked, "How do we know when it's time to stop?" She looked at Ghost, then back at the cadets. Her voice was low, but it landed like a hammer. "When the dog looks a mistake in the eye and chooses not to advance." When the dog looks a mistake in the eye and chooses not to advance. The words rippled long after Mavis had spoken them, circling through academy halls, policy rooms, and eventually a dimly lit theater packed with the curious, the guilty, and the once remissive. The premiere of the documentary Ghost, Silence Under Command was less about celebration and more about reckoning. 3 rows back, in the middle of the crowd, sat the 3 officers who had once laughed in the face of discipline. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't need to. The screen would do the talking. Mavis was not there. Her chair, reserved in the front row, remained empty. But when the lights dimmed, the host stepped up and read her only contribution. She left us a sentence. He said, "Silence is a weapon when they think you have nothing left to say." The film unspooled with clinical precision. Footage of Ghost intercepting danger, standing ground, refusing to retaliate even when provoked. But the camera lingered most on his gaze, forward, patient, burning without fire. One of the officers, once the loudest, began to shake. He rubbed his palms together like trying to erase a memory. Halfway through, he stood and walked out, not looking back. Another stayed frozen, eyes locked on the screen, lips pressed tight. At the final shot, Ghost staring directly into the lens, spine straight, unblinking, he bowed his head. The third, the youngest, wept quietly. A woman in the row behind whispered, not to anyone in particular, "He's not looking at us. He's asking. Have we understood yet?" A retired officer murmured, "I used to think Ghost was terrifying. Now I think I was." The question lingered in the darkened theater long after the credits rolled, not asked aloud, but etched in every breath. Have we understood yet? Weeks passed. Seasons shifted. What began as murmurs became movement, and on a wind-washed morning, beneath a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to storm or shine, the gates of an abandoned compound began to creak open. The rust peeled back with ceremony. Not grand, but deliberate. This was not a rebirth. This was a reclamation. A new plaque had been mounted at the entrance, the letters cut clean into matte steel, Ghost, Academy Defense Without Harm. The old name, the military one, had been removed. So had the statue of the soldier with the raised fist. In its place stood a new monument. Ghost in mid-step, body curved protectively around the silhouette of a small child. He wasn't attacking, he wasn't even snarling, he was shielded. Etched into the arch above the doorway were the words, "Do not command until you understand the cost." The first cohort stood quietly at the entrance. They weren't recruits in uniform, they weren't shaped by tradition, they were survivors, those once labeled unruly, resistant, and untrainable, but today, they stepped forward not to be remade, but to remember who they were before fear rewired their instincts. Mavis did not speak at the opening. She stood back in the shadow of a cedar tree. When the gates opened fully, she gave a single nod. Ghost moved first. No one clapped, no one cheered, but something shifted in the air, as if the world, long clenched, had finally taken a breath. No one clapped, no one cheered, but something shifted in the air, as if the world, long clenched, had finally taken a breath. Years passed. The academy did not grow fast, but it grew true. It became a place not of obedience, but of observation, not of shouting orders, but of learning when silence meant more. Ghost aged. Slowly, his step lost a beat, but not his gaze. He became not just a guardian, but a reminder. And then one autumn morning, without announcement, without alarm, the academy gates stayed closed. The sky was pale gray, no birdsong, just a stillness too quiet to ignore. By noon, word spread among the students. By evening, no one had spoken it aloud, but they all knew Mavis Hampton was gone. There was no service, no black dresses, no folded flags, just Ghost sitting at the threshold of her home, unmoving. He stayed there 13 hours, eyes fixed, muscles slacken. He didn't bark, he didn't whine, he waited. When the door opened, he stepped inside and never came out again. No grave was marked, no stone erected, only a quiet plaque on the academy wall. I don't need noise, I need understanding. At the academy entrance, a new statue was placed. It wasn't grand, just ghost head tilted, ears alert, eyes forward. A small child stood behind his flank, safe in his shadow. The plaque beneath read nothing about war, only this: listen before you strike. Student once whispered, standing before the statue, "That dog taught me to hear before I bit." Years later, a broadcaster would say, "She was the only one who made justice roar without ever needing to raise her voice." And that voice still echoes, not loud, but clear.